you. Okay. The other announcement that I'd like to just make before we start is, in addition to these upcoming talks, is just to give a plug for our AERA Science Teaching and Learning SIG. If you're not a member, that's please feel free. You know, in terms of professional organizations, this is how we say like and subscribe. We just want you to join as a SIG. If this is the kind of thing that interests you, if you're not already a member. For those of you who are already members, welcome. We're glad to have you here. And I'll just tease that we're planning something really, really exciting for Philadelphia for our gathering. We'll have more information about that later. But all of the upcoming talks are on our SIG page. All the ones that we have nailed down dates for, you can feel free to register for them in advance. And Zoom does that really handy thing where it sends you an announcement. Oh, I can see, you can't see that, let's say. So I'm sharing this page here. Right, so this is the AERA Science Teaching and Learning SIG. If you just go to AERA and search the SIGs, or you can go ahead, I'll share that link and you can bookmark it if you want for the future talks. So without any further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Erin Furtak. Erin, welcome. How are you?
Thanks so much. I'm really great. How are you doing?
That's great. And it's a nice picture you have in the background, very seasonal appropriate.
Yes.
Is there actually snow on the ground in Boulder?
There's, I mean, a lot of it melted in the last 24 hours, but I was out for a run this morning and I was running over snow and ice for a lot of it. So, but so it doesn't look quite this idyllic now. It's a little more brown.
Fantastic. So I've got a copy of your book here, and I've got plenty of questions to ask you. And just to talk a little bit about the format of what we'll do over the next hour, I have a couple questions. We'll just sort of soften the ground and talk about the book a little bit. And then maybe about halfway through, I'll just ask folks to use the hand raising feature in Zoom, and you'll float to the top of my list on the screen here, and we'll just go we'll go through one at a time and let people ask their questions. If you don't want to ask it out loud on camera or on Zoom, you can type it into the chat, and we'll do it that way. Okay, and there. Oh, sorry, I didn't hit return on. There's the link for in the chat. So, Erin, why don't we just? If I'd like to get started by just asking if you could give a brief description of your book for anyone who hasn't yet had a chance to read it.
Sure. I feel like I should have been more prepared for this specific question.
But then again,
I think that give me a second to I'll say that I was trying to do a comprehensive treatment of what we're trying to do with formative assessment in the wave of three-dimensional science education reform, and to do that in a way that was deeply informed by sociocultural theory, and to kind of bridge literatures that are often separate, that are kind of more how are we framing the work theoretically as researchers, and what does this look like in practice, and trying to do both of those things. So having kind of a strong theoretical framework with rich examples from practice, and kind of take away tools and resources that people could use to try this out in their own classrooms too.
Thanks. Well, I mean, I want to just follow up on the sociocultural piece for a second there. Other assessment has been framed in other ways. What were some of the shortcomings of those other ways of framing assessment that led you to sort of undertake this larger project?
Yeah, well, I think that, historically, assessment has often been framed as kind of the knowledge that a person carries around in their head, and how can we find ways of kind of approximating or understanding what that knowledge looks like. And, we can really think about that in sophisticated ways in terms of how the knowledge is structured and how people use that knowledge. But the more I, as a researcher, was out in classrooms, it just became so clear that there's just so much more going on, particularly in the context of formative assessment, with interactions between people and how they're kind of sharing their ideas and discussions, and the learning that happens in that place. And then, of course, consistent with kind of how we're framing learning in the kind of three-dimensional wave of science education reform, is all based upon sociocultural theories of learning, and thinking about learning as changes in disciplinary practice, and thinking about individuals as being, having cultural and historical contexts that matter, and schools as places that are also existing in social and cultural context. And this is where I have to give a shout out to my amazing research team that over the years we've kind of been moving more into sociocultural framings to describe, to design, and to study formative assessment. And so it was fun to finally just have the space to completely go there and think about how does something like activity theory inform the way that we might think about all the different ways that formative assessment happens within a classroom activity system. So it helps us see so much more than if we're just thinking about assessment as a piece of paper or something a person does on a computer and just analyzing their responses to that.
Well, there's two things in that response I want to ask you about. One is just sort of I do want to talk about cultural history. Well, I want to talk about activity theory.
Yeah.
But you mentioned your research team, and I know you outside of this Zoom also. So I wonder if you could just sort of tell us the story of like your whole research agenda coming into, like, how did it become this book? Because I mean, we were chatting a little bit beforehand, but there's a lot of you in here. And a lot of the things I know you've been working on for the past decade and more, like, found their way into this book. So I wonder if you could just tell us the story of taking your scholarship and getting it all here.
Oh, wow. Well, so I think I have to start with Sarah Porter Hills, who was one of my first graduate students, and Deb Morrison, and Kate Henson. I think the four of us together did one of my very first studies at a local high school, working with 7 really spectacular biology teachers over 3 years, and started with just kind of designing formative assessment tasks. And I remember in one of the really early meetings I had with Sarah in my office, I can remember like what chair she was sitting on, because this left such an impression on me. I said something about, well, when we're doing the formative assessment co-design with the teachers, because we're going to support the teachers in learning. And this was probably, 2009 or 2010. And Sarah said, well, what do you mean by teacher learning? And it was one of those moments as an advisor where I thought, I don't have a good answer to that question. And I knew enough to recognize how problematic it was that I was talking so much about teacher learning without really formulating what that meant. Being at an environment like the University of Colorado Boulder at the time, where Chris Gutierrez was one of my colleagues, and I kind of famously was meeting with her when she was at CU, kind of interviewing for a job, and she was talking with one of my colleagues, and they kept saying chat this, chat that, and I kind of raised my hand. And I said, what are you talking about? What's chat? And everybody just kind of got quiet and turned and looked at me. And I realized in that moment that while I had studied sociocultural theory as a graduate student, I hadn't really applied it as a theoretical lens in my research as a graduate student or in my postdoc. And even though my postdoc was basically, educational psychology, we were coming from a very deeply cognitive frame. And so it was that moment where Sarah asked me that question, how are we thinking about teacher learning, where I realized I am just at the start of my career as an assistant professor, and I am just starting on a brand new journey of learning that took me through, I think, the publication of this book, kind of going back to foundational readings by, Jim Greeno and Chris Gutierrez and Ergo Engstrom and many other, Barbara Rogoff, to just kind of really understand, what does it mean when we frame learning from this perspective? What does that mean for kids? What does that mean for what we're looking for when we go into a classroom? What does that mean for teacher learning? And over time, in collaboration with Kate and Deb and Sarah and many others, developed a much more robust understanding of how we wanted to think about learning that went way beyond surveys, because we actually did surveys with the students and the teachers in my first study, which we never analyzed because we discovered that we were looking for learning in a really different way. And so that was kind of the beginning of the journey. I mean, it's probably a very long story to get to like what actually ended up in the book, but just to kind of say that I think when we get hired as assistant professors, we think like, oh, we've made it and I have all the answers and I have everything figured out. And it's just as the beginning of a series of questions that just deepen our learning. And to me, that's what keeps it interesting, I guess.
Thanks. Well, I feel like there's an open parentheses on that story and I can provide the closed parentheses. So how might you answer that question about teacher learning now if you were to be asked that in your office again?
Yes, well, and I actually said something about this in a seminar at CU recently where, because I'm going to kind of take a backward step before closing the parentheses, which is that for a whole span of my career, people were really kind of pushing me to develop measures for pedagogical content knowledge as the thing that we were looking for in terms of teacher learning. And the more time I spent with teachers in classrooms, I realized that no, we're really conceptualizing teacher learning as kind of teacher reflectiveness, teachers changes in their classroom practices, teachers conversations with each other and how they conceptualize learning themselves. And I realized that I wasn't as interested in trying to look at it as pedagogical content knowledge. I really wanted to think about how are we thinking about, you know, learning as becoming someone else, having a new identity, and really being able to see how that manifests in a teacher's everyday practices. That at the end of the day is what really makes a difference for kids and their experiences in school. So I guess that's my answer to the question.
Okay. Excellent. Thanks. Well, I want to talk about some details of science assessment, but first, so you mentioned the cultural historical activity theory chat. For those of you just tuning in, that's different from Chat GPT. I'm thinking, right?
Yes.
Right? It's a different kind of chat, different kind of book chat, right? But the I wonder if you can just say I mean, you talk about it at length in the book, but I think one question that I had after both reading the book and refamiliarizing myself with some of that literature that I hadn't gone back to in a while. And I will tell you, I sent Engstrom's paper to at least one doc student who needed that framework.
Mm-hmm.
What does cultural historical activity theory do for, like, what work does it do as a theory that other theories, even other sociocultural theories, don't?
Yeah, well, I mean, Doug, are you the one who originally said how a good theoretical framework is like a pair of X-ray glasses, or?
Yes, I do use that clip from John Carpenter's "They Live" in my
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So so we think about I think that the kind of my simplest answer to that is to think about how we can conceptualize an activity system that's not just now, but it's kind of embedded in cultural and historical context. And so when that's applied, and it consists of all these different things, like who are the participants and who are the people who are present there? What is the thing that they're trying to do together? What is the kind of object of their activity? How is labor divided up amongst lots of different people? What are the tools and the materials and artifacts that kind of organize their activity? Are just kind of some of the elements that we could think about within that system. And the way I think about how this is like a good pair of X-ray glasses when we look at a classroom is that, again, historically, we often will think about assessment as being like a thing or a task that kids do. But when we think about formative assessment, it actually is really helpful to understand the whole activity system that's going on in the classroom and who is the teacher and what is their identity and what have their experiences been with science and with teaching, and how does that manifest in their interactions with kids, and who are the learners and what are they interested in and what have their prior experiences been, and how are we organizing interactions among people? You know, how are different kinds of tasks or tools or things that we have in the classroom, like, for example, a whiteboard, you know, how are we using a whiteboard for a group of kids to draw a model? And how is that an act of assessment? And how is the teacher's interaction with the kids and listening to their ideas maybe just as important or maybe even more important than what they're writing on the whiteboard? And how are those interactions supporting their learning? So it just helps us. I always think about it. I was told by my editor I was overusing this phrase, so it's probably still in the book a lot, but, you know, broadening our lens and what we're looking at and what we're paying attention to when we think about assessment. So it's, you know, it's all these different things that are happening in the moment. And then also the context and the experiences of the people who are participating in it. You know, the school, the classroom is being embedded within a science department, within a school that has certain kinds of policies, and in a district and in a state. I mean, there's so many different layers to that system that help us understand what really actually means when a teacher is asking a student a question about, tell me where you've seen this before, or, what does this mean to you, or how are you making sense of this? There's so much more that's going on in that interaction than just like a question that might be on an assessment. So that's how I like to think about activity theory, is kind of helping us highlight these different elements of what's going on in an instance of assessment. And that's, in the end, what I use to organize the chapters of the book.
So I'm going to ask a question as if I'm a grad student in your class. So then, is it like, is activity theory, like, does it have the epistemology of it is like that knowledge exists in that whole system, as compared to like a pedagogical content knowledge where you say, do you know this thing? Do you know this thing? Do you know this thing?
Yes.
Like
and
knowledge,
I think
the way conceiving of knowledge is different in those two ways of looking.
Yeah, and Sam Severance, who was also a former PhD student at CU Boulder, one of the many people who's helped me support my learning about this over the years, he and I used to always talk about how activity systems that are in shifts. So like, especially if we're like changing the science standards, for example, if we're kind of adopting new ways of being and interacting with kids as teachers, there's going to be tension between, like what I think science is and how it might be represented in curriculum materials, and, what the kids might know and what we want them to kind of come to understand as part of the science standards. And so like taking an activity lens also helps us think about how these tensions are just inevitable in systems that are in processes of change, rather than like, we're going to get it right and everything's going to be all figured out, and then we're going to do science assessment correctly or right. I always have to say right with quotation marks, because what's right and what's wrong, but it helps us see how, when we're shifting elements of the system, that pulls on other parts of it at the same time, I guess.
So I've got a couple more questions just to ready to go, and then we'll open it up to the large group. So feel free, if you want to put things in the chat, just to mark a space or save an idea, please feel free. So I want to roll back a little bit to, this notion of like, it's almost a definition of assessment, right? As a system rather than as a more fixed notion. And in discussions about assessment, the notion of assessment not being equivalent to grading, right? Like that's sort of like entry level, learning about assessment. Assessment is not always grading, even though, we still hear teachers say, okay, I'm going to pass out the assessment, and it's a, multiple choice test, right? We still know that there, but you go much further in reframing what an assessment is and what it isn't, especially in the context of teaching and learning science. And so I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about what you see the boundaries of assessments to be, not like the boundary, not like the assessment boundary in NGSS, but like what in science teaching wouldn't be an assessment by this?
Yeah.
It is so broad that it encompasses everything that happens in a science classroom.
Right. Well, so this is where I'm kind of coming, and I don't know if this is in the book, and this might just be my thinking in the last year since I finished the book, but I mean, assessment is happening all the time. And we think about assessments like the SAT and the ACT and other kinds of standardized tests as being really consequential for learners, but really the interactions that kids have with teachers on a moment-to-moment basis, the teacher, my advisor, Rich Shabelson, used to always say that teaching is just a process of continuous decision-making, and teachers are always making these inferences about what kids know and are able to do, and using that to inform their subsequent instruction, whether or not we call that assessment. And I like thinking about having an assessment frame or orientation as a teacher all the time, because it helps me be aware of what are the consequences of my decision to call on a particular kid or to set up the classroom in a particular way, and how are my interactions with kids transmitting intentionally or unintentionally what counts as knowledge or what counts as competence in a classroom. Like if I only call on the kids who know the answers, or if I only call on the kids who have a particular level of competence in the English language, what does that mean about who gets to decide and whose answers are valued in the classroom, versus, broadening who's participating and how we're supporting those learners. So I don't know. I that's a hard question, because I think I think everything is an active assessment. I feel like and I know that there's lots of people out there who will disagree with me. And I've bumped heads with Dylan William about this before, about how we're defining formative assessment. And I really enjoy that healthy, lively debate about where we bound what counts as formative assessment and not. Because I mean, I won't go down the wormhole, but there's a really interesting debate in the literature in the mid 2000s about where do we draw the line at what constitutes an active assessment? Does feedback have to be involved or not? And I would say no. And then I'll just not go down the rabbit hole.
But you do spend time in the book talking about formative assessment not necessarily being equivalent to a task. I wonder if we just unpack that a little bit for.
So Randy Bennett in 2011 wrote a great paper where he talks about how formative assessment is kind of a complicated interaction between, it's a process and a thing at the same time. And so we can think about a task as like that material artifact that organizes activity around teachers finding out what kids know and, you know, supporting their subsequent learning. But the process of formative assessment, or like informal formative assessment, as we might call it, is this kind of question, you know, like back pocket questions, like we might talk about in ambitious science teaching, like how do I decide what that question is? And I'm going around and I'm asking kids and I'm developing understandings of what the class knows, where they're at, what additional supports they need. But that process is supported by a task or a thing that the students are doing together. So I see them as really being interrelated, but I always, you know, analytically as a researcher, we kind of pull them apart. We say, well, let's look at the task and see how the task is designed as an artifact to organize a particular kind of activity. And then how are the teachers participating and how are the students participating? And, you know, we kind of level it from there. But so I think they're very closely related, but it's also useful to talk about them separately, if that makes sense.
Well, speaking of being useful, I know you do a lot of work in school districts and with teachers directly. How do you talk about this with teachers who might have, you know, their activity might be organized around this, you know, material artifact of needing to provide a grade or some sort of, you know, accountability metric back to, you know, school leadership, families and communities and parents, and like, what's that interface look like when you're talking about these sort of very rich ideas of assessment and people who are like, what do I do Monday?
Yeah, well, in the long-term research practice partnership that we're in our 10th year now. I think we entered that partnership in a time of where the kind of state of Colorado was undergoing particular processes of teacher evaluation that sounded a lot like the classroom assessment that teachers were doing, and it kind of bred some skepticism about what our role was. And so first I have to say that I've never met a teacher who wasn't really interested in supporting their kids and finding out what they know. And so we always start with what teachers are currently doing in their practice and build from their strengths. And then, you know, sometimes we do direct brokering with the school district. In one of our studies, we actually went to the principal with the teachers to make a request to have more planning time for the teachers. In our research practice partnership, we actually started thinking about how we could build firewalls around what the teachers were doing in their classroom. So like what was just for them and the kids to improve learning in the classroom, and that wasn't for accountability purposes. And since there's such a nice, rich literature on the effectiveness of formative assessment in classrooms, we can usually point to effect sizes from meta-analyses with district leaders to say, it's going to help the kids in this classroom learn if we just let this happen in a protective way. And here's how grading hurts that. And here's how adding on accountability measures to low stakes assessment hurts that process. And in the context of that research practice partnership, we've also, and this with my colleague Derek Briggs, we've also built on layers about, well, here's how the formative assessments relates to summative assessments, and here's how that relates to interim assessments. And so we kind of look at it like the whole kind of coherent assessment system. But then as a researcher, I always put my blinders on and go back into the classroom and say, okay, we built the firewall and now we're just doing the thing about supporting learners and teachers in low stakes assessment that's not graded. But again, it's that kind of activity system lens where we say, we can't just close the classroom door and pretend like these other things don't have an influence on what's going on. And if we don't acknowledge that as researchers and collaborators in schools and districts, nobody would want to work with us because we wouldn't be acknowledging the environment that we're all working in.
Well, and when you build those firewalls, like are sort of the, let's just say, school level practices around grading, are they still like ongoing and you're like, yeah, they're happening, but we're not really paying attention? This stuff we're doing is sort of insulated from that, or is it? I'm sure it's messier than that, but
yeah, I mean, there's lots of different ways that we've dealt with it. It's funny because I kind of deliberately don't talk about grading in the book.
I noticed. Yeah.
Yes. And I think in a context of another writing project I've been doing, I've realized that I'm not as up on the literature on grading as I probably should be, because we kind of say if formative assessment is happening every day, it is worth paying attention to just that, and then to think about how we can kind of silo it a little bit. Like we're gonna do a planned task at the end of this sequence of instruction, but maybe what we grade is how students are participating. And how do we think about participation? Participation is making a model. Participation is annotating another student's model. Participating is sharing an idea in a whole class conversation, or presenting a group model out to the class, or something like that, participating in a gallery walk. So that what's valued in that place is taking a risk, sharing an idea that might not have the whole picture, or might, share a part of ourselves that feels a little vulnerable. If we're going to be graded, that just shuts all of that down. So that's why I try not to talk about grading, because we really want to preserve these kind of happy is not the right word, these kind of safe, protected spaces where kids and learners, they're having fun. They know that they can share an idea without getting shut down. That's really important to do formative assessment well.
So one last question, and then we'll open it up to the group. So one other thing that that I don't want to say you take aim at, but I was really excited about this book, and I was talking to one of my students about it, and I was talking to the distinction that you made between sort of individual notions of assessment versus collective, like, because we're of this systems lens, this activity theory lens that you take, assessment of a group makes sense within that context. Like, and the teacher said to me, well, we grade lab reports, they get a group grade for that. And I'm sorry, I'm using the G word, grade, again, but like, like we assess, students' participation in lab report. But to me, there was still sort of I wasn't able to put my finger on the distinction between that practice, which when I think about it, I did that when I, in the classroom in the 90s, I did that, right? But like, there's something different just even about assessment, the way that you're framing it and talking about it, that makes that sort of individualist versus group, assessment different. And I wonder if you could just talk about that sort of singular versus plural, framing of assessment, and say whatever you want about it. I mean, you talk about it a lot in the book, but like, how is that different from what you and I did when we gave group lab grades?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely, you're sending me back to 1999 with lab reports and kind of how we were handling them in my classroom. I mean, I'm going to go back again to this idea of like, how are we conceptualizing learning? How are we theorizing what learning is? And I think we live in a very individualistic society where it's about kind of, marks and points, and kind of our school systems are set up this way. And then we look at learning out in the world. This is where I feel like I'm starting to say very radical things, and I feel like I'm walking out on the edge of a cliff, but I'm
goading you into doing that. Just
yeah, you are goading me. I think that out in the world, we're working in group settings. We're interacting with people. We're learning in these ways. We're supporting other people. And there has to be a way of doing that in groups and classrooms too. So it's not all always boiled down only to the individual. And even like Vygotsky was talking about, like what we're able to do when we're, with other people who kind of help us go slightly beyond what we might do alone. And isn't that a good thing? And why are we always trying to shrink it back to what only an individual brings? So this is where I guess putting on the blinders and just paying attention to formative assessment skirts other elements of assessment systems that are very much about, who graduates, who gets promoted to the next grade, who's learned enough of what we think about as biology to go on to the next science. I'm not trying to say that that's not important, but since so much of the learning that happens in formative assessment is through talking with people and representing our ideas, it makes sense to kind of do that as a group and to not necessarily have a grade for it, because then if we take students individually and put them on a computer and have them doing an assessment alone later, they've learned a lot through that experience. So I guess I'm not saying it's only learning in groups, but that we know from research that that benefits the individual later as well, but it also kind of prepares people to interact with and learn in these collaborative settings. And I'll also have to say that as a teacher who's studied my own formative assessment in the classroom, it's actually easier as a teacher to get the kids working with each other and supporting their learning rather than having it all go through me. It's not just better for them, it's better for me as well, and kind of my cognitive load, I should say, at the end of the day.
Thank you. You answered. I'm satisfied with that response.
Okay. Okay, good.
All right. So at this, I mean, I have plenty more questions, but I don't want to be selfish and hold the floor. So why don't we go ahead and open up, if anybody has a question, you can either use the hand raising feature on Zoom. If that's not working for you and you want to try to unmute as a bid for attention, I can recognize that as well. So who'd like to ask Erin a question?
You have to have your mandatory 15 seconds of Zoom silence.
Or at least contribute to the conversation. We do welcome comments in addition to questions. It's that kind of thing. There we go. Thank you, Megan. Feel free to unmute and ask your question.
Hi, thanks so much. So this is maybe related to what you were just talking about in terms of like group assessment and things. So I was thinking about what you said earlier when you were talking about chat and how using chat as a framework kind of reveals how knowledge exists in the system rather than like in an individual person's head. And so that just got me wondering about like what it means to assess an individual student then, if it's less about like what's in a particular student's head versus like what we know as a class.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So tell me what the question, what exactly I really love, is the question kind of what is the knowledge of the class, or yeah, can you say more?
Yeah. So I guess my question is just kind of like, what do you think about that? Like, I guess the question is like, what does it mean to assess individual kids if we think about knowledge existing in a system or in a whole classroom rather than with an individual student?
Yeah, I mean, obviously is not the right word. I'm thinking about how, so now I'm thinking about Laurie Shepard, who was lovely and wrote the introduction to the book and has been an incredible mentor of mine since I've been at CU. And she always talks about how sociocultural theory isn't replacing previous or other ways of framing knowledge. It's not that like cognitive theory doesn't exist and that it's wrong, that we don't have knowledge as individuals that we kind of carry around in our head and we can't kind of study how an individual might have their knowledge structured in a particular way. It just kind of depends on, sorry, I finished that example, that sociocultural theory kind of encompasses all of the previous theories. And so I think it's kind of what we attend to and what we value. And so as a researcher, we definitely have individual students give responses to formative assessment tasks, for example. So Jason Buell, another one of my wonderful former PhD students, studied a bunch of different student responses to a lot of chemistry, physics, and biology tasks as part of his dissertation. And Kate Henson, who's another graduate student of mine that I mentioned earlier, studied kind of the processes by which teachers develop those tasks. And then I'm working with Clarissa Deverell Rico, another one of my former graduate students. We're looking at how those tasks were facilitated in whole classrooms. So I just use this as an example to say that like we see the knowledge represented in the whole class, but that doesn't mean that we can't also look at kind of what individuals are contributing to that. And because assessment often defaults back to a kid and a task, we are kind of privileging this kind of broader lens and trying to look more at collaboration and activity because our system is kind of set up to kind of snap back to that individual example. I don't know if that answers your question at all, Megan, but that's kind of what came up for me. Yes, thank you. Okay. Thanks for asking the question.
The floor is open. Suzanne.
Hi, Erin. So full disclosure, I was both one of Doug's master's students and also doctoral students. But I haven't read your book yet, so I'm sure some of this is in the book and I'm really excited to read it. But I'm actually in the process of preparing or modifying an assessment course for the spring.
Oh,
And one of the things that was almost like an existential crisis for me in my master's program was doing an assignment Doug had us do called Assessing the Assessment. And I feel like I end up talking about it all the time. And it made me really have to sit back and think about all of the things that were embedded in me as a student myself, especially in science education. And I'm just thinking, and it took a lot of conversation and back and forth, and even probably reflection afterwards, even completing my master's program, to really see what the value in that assignment was and the change in my own ideas around assessment. So I guess my question is, when you're working with teachers and you're bringing in these new ideas, how do you even begin the conversation, and how do you start getting buy-in from them to start moving towards these ideas about formative assessment rather than the traditional ones they're most likely bringing in?
yeah. So before I answer that question, I want to talk about assessing the assessment real quick, because as I was finishing the book, there's some really great work that Jennifer Randall at the University of Michigan, and kind of the director of the Center for Measurement Justice, has been publishing around kind of heuristics to look at tasks themselves, and specifically from a justice, anti-racist lens, and thinking about, who decided on what we're assessing anyway. Who are the people who designed the assessment? How is the assessment used with kids? What kinds of decisions are being made? And so there's a paper that she had, I think it's in 2021, color neutral isn't a thing, that is just incredible. And that whole framework is in there. And I write about it briefly at the end of the book. But I think that this idea of assessing the assessment is, I just love that task. That's a great place to start. So with teachers, often what we'll do is start with video, and start with a really broad question that's not using the word assessment or test on purpose. And like a question that's like, how do you know what kids know? How do you find that out? And we have kind of there's kind of a carefully curated set of videos that we've collected over the years, where we see teachers working with kids and just talking to them. We'll show the teachers the tasks, so we're kind of trying to represent the whole system. And we'll kind of invite them to look at all the different ways that teachers are finding out what kids know in this particular common shared example. And then we'll kind of invite teachers to reflect on their own practice and kind of see how they're doing this all the time too. And so we always kind of look for an opening in teachers' current practice and grow from there. So we're not ever coming in and saying you're doing this wrong, because we don't actually think that they're doing it wrong. We just think that like there are elements of what they're doing that we want to continue to grow, that are consistent with these kind of informal ways of finding out what kids know and how to, but they give us these really cool, rich answers. Do we continue to kind of build on those answers and get them to bring those out and more into the classroom? And how is that viewed as an active assessment? And it takes a long time. I mean, in the book, we talk about how some schools we work with teachers for 3 or 4 years. It's really kind of a journey. And because it's not just about supporting the kids' learning, it's about supporting the teachers' learning as well. But we always start with kind of some shared artifact. And then are always inviting teachers into reflecting on their own practice, trying things out, coming back and talking about how it went. Like, if you feel like you don't want to do a classroom conversation with your kids, let's try a really structured think, pair, share, and then come back and talk to a group about that. So it's just, lots of examples of the kinds of things that teachers have kind of come to our groups and tried and then found success with, and we kind of grow it from there. So that's kind of 2 answers to the one question, I guess.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Thanks, Suzanne. Okay, we have a little bit more time for a few more questions. Please go ahead and raise your hand in Zoom, or feel free to unmute if your button is covered there. Who else has a question or comment, something they'd want to discuss with Erin? I actually have one. Oh, there we go. Okay. Jason. Hi, Jason. It's good to see you.
Hi there. I'll make sure I'm seen. So thank you, Erin, for sharing with us. I think there were a couple things that you said that I'm just kind of curious of how you parse out with teachers in working with this. We're deep in my place of practice with universal design for learning, and teachers kind of struggling with this idea of how do you assess, multiple ways and somehow equate them. And I think the word privileging is sort of key here for me, in that we always kind of default to our preferred way of deciding, like as a teacher, of like, okay, that tells me the kid knew what I wanted them to know, but it's still kind of me doing that. And I think that's like I don't know if it's not a solvable struggle, but it's certainly something that I think we need to talk about, of like, how do I not privilege a more traditional assessment? Like I saw them participating, I saw them doing things in my classroom, but then I gave them the test and they didn't do well. Versus I saw the student not doing those things that I want to value in participating in my classroom. I gave them the test and they did well. And, so how do I kind of reconcile, like, okay, maybe they both know about the same amount, and I maybe know that they know it, or maybe I don't. I guess it's kind of not a question, but how do you reconcile that idea of what we privilege as teachers?
Yeah, I feel like that's so, I appreciate the way that you frame that, because I think that that's like a central challenge when we're trying to prioritize kids' sense making, is that the way that they think about things and describe things aren't necessarily going to line up with the way that we understand them. And I was even thinking about this today because I was working on a book chapter, and Microsoft Word is always underlining and telling me it's wrong when I say understandings. Like, understanding is just one thing and it's either right or it's wrong. It's like, no, I mean understandings. There are multiple ways of understanding this. And so a lot of the work that we do with teachers is just how do we navigate these conversations when kids are kind of really explaining the way that they think about things. I was watching a video today from 2019 where kids are talking about how it's harder to breathe when the air is thin, and the teacher is trying to really like probe the kid. So what does it mean? So we're always saying when the air is thin, what does that mean with the air is thin? And what is that, ultimately where the teacher is going is, what does that have to do with cellular respiration? But that's a long way from the kids, all like leveraging all these everyday examples. And especially when it comes to something like assessment, it's definitely easier for us to say like, well, here's the right answer and I got it, and now we're going to move on. And so I hear you, like creating the space to have the kids really air out their ideas and talk about their understandings, which aren't the same as ours, what it is that we're going for, I guess. And the book has lots of examples of like talk strategies that teachers use to do that. But I think what we're starting to do in our research is try to think about how part of what we have to grapple with is how we understand things ourselves as teachers. Like the work starts with us and understanding our identities and how we know things, so that we can recognize when we're maybe wielding that in a way that's not equitable or fair with respect to what the kids are bringing into class. So I don't know, I was thinking with you, not really answering the question.
Thanks, Jason. Floor is open. We have a couple more.
Oh.
Okay. I'm going to read out Preetha's question here since it's in the chat. It says, thanks, Erin. Within the sociocultural approaches of teaching and learning, how do you perceive the role of peers in formative assessment? In formative assessment, William, 2007, have emphasized the role of peers in assessment, but in a classroom setting, how much emphasis should be placed on peer assessment?
Yeah, so this is where I look to Heidi Andrade's work, and she's mostly has worked in kind of English liberal arts, but mostly like arts education, like music and things like this, but looks at how, again, I'm going back to this kind of activity frame where we think about how can some artifact that we create as a class, like a rubric, and talking with the kids about that, support kids then doing some kind of peer-to-peer assessment where I'm going to look at someone's model and see how they've shown both visible and invisible things, or how they've used labels to help me understand how energy flows within a system or something like this. So that kind of learning in interaction between individuals mediated by a particular kind of tool that might have baked into it kind of our class's collective understanding of like what does a good model look like. And I'm not saying a right model, but like a model that kind of as a way of representing our ideas. How are we giving each other feedback, for example, on, you know, this could be made a little bit more clear or something like that. So I think about, we definitely think about kids interacting with each other as a big part of that larger activity system. And then with my kind of classroom teacher lens, I think about, so how am I going to organize this in a way that is still kind of valuing what it is that we're trying to do as a class? And that's where things like rubrics and their kind of task structures can help support kids in looking at each other's work, for example, or working in small groups. But I definitely agree with Dylan Williams kind of, I mean, his 2007 chapter is just such a great reference for all things formative assessment. And I totally agree that peer assessment is a really important part of it.
Thanks, Preeta.
Mm-hmm.
Kate Miller asks, how can chat support thinking about assessment in ways that are more humanizing?
Yeah, I love that. Humanizing lens, that's, I don't know, having humanizing pedagogies is definitely something I've been thinking a lot about over the last year. And, you know, starting with who we are as humans, you know, what communities we come from, what languages we speak, what our experiences have been in and out of school is a way of humanizing our students and not just treating them as a person who shows up in our classroom and is here to learn science from us. And then further kind of inviting students to kind of share their ideas and their experiences in class is another way of kind of having a humanizing pedagogy. So when I think about, like, again, like thinking about an activity system as existing in a larger cultural and historical context, part of that is acknowledging who the individual participants are as actors and how they're showing up in that space, and then how the ways that we interact with each other are allowing us to be full humans in those moments of learning, and not just trying to, you know, give teachers the answers they're looking for, or not just trying to kind of move through the curriculum without pausing to really make sense of like, where are we, or like to use open sci-ed language, like taking stock of where we are. What have we learned so far? What questions have we answered? What are we still wondering about? And how does that help us navigate forward? So I kind of wish I had written about humanizing pedagogies more in the book, because something we also notice in classrooms where formative assessment is really helping support the students is that there's laughter, and the kids are, you know, just kind of spontaneously asking questions, and they feel respected by their peers, and they feel respected by their teacher. And this is all kind of that larger system that lets us be our full selves in those spaces. That's a great question. Thanks.
If I could connect that to your Microsoft Word underlining understandings.
Yes.
Right, which is sort of a benign example of pattern matching of computers giving some feedback on writing. You know where this is going. So you know, there are cognitive, and at the end of the book, like, you get into some of the cognitive and time challenges for teachers giving substantive feedback, right? Like the more detailed your feedback, the longer it's going to take you to do it. And now we have this other chat sitting out there with enormous potential for both positive and, you know, disruptive ways of influencing assessment. I just wonder what you're thinking about in terms of, and just to be clear, like even the GRE, when I took the GRE ages ago to get into grad school, a human being did not read my persuasive essay. So like this pattern matching stuff has been around for a really long time. But now they put this fancy label on it of AI, and now, instead of Super Alexa, they could have called it Super Alexa and we all would have been fine with it, but it's AI, and now we're kind of but I wonder what's your thinking around some of these systems of assessment that are, let's just say, less than humanizing because there might not be a human component to it?
Yeah. I mean, I have so much to say and so little actual information about this. So that's why I'm pausing. I know that, my colleague Xiaoming Zhai recently wrote this, like the train has already left the station. We're already doing this. And he also already has a project where they're kind of looking at, AI and assistive technologies in the context of assessment. And I'm teaching a writing class this semester to graduate students across departments, and like half the students in class are doing something about assistive AI. And I think that coming back to that kind of activity system framing, how is this a tool to support us in some kind of activity that we're trying to engage in, like sharing and understanding student thinking. So back in 2018, Sarah and Deb and I wrote a chapter where we were looking at the work that people are already doing. We're already doing then around intelligent tutor systems and how that can help things like feedback. I realize that I'm very low tech and still just thinking about like, how are we supporting kids through listening and pushing them on their thinking in classroom conversations. And I can imagine that in the future, AI will be really helpful for that. But I feel like I don't really know at this point.
Well, to maybe land in a better place than that sort of daunting.
Yeah.
So how do you work with teachers to address that specific problem of sort of cognitive overload with giving high quality feedback?
Yeah. So, I write about my own cognitive overload teaching this way in the book, and how it can be really exhausting. And I think that one of the main things that we do is kind of talking to teachers about having an enactment plan for doing a formative assessment. That's really important. It's not the kind of thing that you would necessarily do every day, but like if I'm doing an open-sided storyline and I know on this particular day we're going to do this formative assessment task, I want to spend some time thinking about how am I launching this task with kids to kind of use some of Ho-Sun King's language around that. How am I putting the kids in different kinds of participation structures? How are they representing their ideas? So it's not just me going in there and like, I'm just going to talk and listen to the kids for 20 minutes straight. It's kind of broken up. Kids are doing a lot of kind of working together and kind of producing kind of initial and group ideas or models or explanations. So it's kind of limiting the amount of information coming at you and having the students support each other. And we also work with the teachers around looking at student work. So we're kind of anticipating like, what are the kinds of things that kids say when we ask questions like this? And how can we use things like talk moves to get them to unpack their thinking more? And how is it okay for us to say like, okay, so I'm trying to understand what you're saying. Can you say that again? Okay, I think I hear you saying this, and asking another follow-up question. And it's part of it is buying time to let us think, but part of it is also encouraging the kids to kind of articulate their thinking in new ways and look at it for new dimensions of it that might help us all kind of understand that. So I think having a good plan is the place where we often start from. And then when these conversations and enactments go well, it's demanding, but it's also so exciting because, I've had teachers like come out of the room and like give us high fives because it was like, oh, it worked. It went great. The kids learned stuff. They had these great examples. I want to talk to you more about it. And it's like enlivens our practice, even though it's a hard thing to do, I guess.
That's wonderful. Thanks. I'm going to give the last question to Meenakshi Sharma, who I'll read it. It's in the chat. In the beginning, you talked about teacher learning as a process of becoming and identifying shifts in a certain manner. I'm curious to know what kinds of becoming shifts you have observed among teachers in your research. Perhaps you could provide an example?
Yeah, so the one that comes immediately to mind is from one of the early studies we did. with these biology teachers that we followed for 3 years. And at the beginning of the study, we were kind of going, we think not just about assessments, but we also think about the curriculum in which those assessments are embedded and how that's sequenced and how the assessments tell us particular things at different points in kind of a journey of learning. And we had a big conversation as a group about how to sequence a unit about natural selection and evolution. Like, do we start it on the first day saying we're going to learn about evolution and here's the definition of evolution and unpack it, or are we going to build up to it in a, you know, through particular types of activities? And I remember one teacher at the beginning of the study was really adamant about starting from the beginning and kind of then unpacking it into smaller pieces. And at the end of the study, and we actually had a video of her saying this in one of our professional learning community meetings, she said, I realized that what we were doing is like we were giving away the punchline of a joke at the very beginning, and it took away the kids' opportunity to make sense of it themselves. And so those are the kinds of aha moments that we hear teachers like name, or, you know, like when we try a task one way and maybe the first time it doesn't go so well, we come back and we redesign it and we bring it back in. And then the teacher's like, oh, it works so much better when we took away some of the structure, when we made the outcome space a little bit bigger. These are the kinds of becoming that we start to see. You know, seeing a teacher try, like the think, pair, share example, we had a teacher who just did not, if I let the kids talk, I'm going to completely lose control of the class. And so with his colleagues, it's not just me, it's like in collaboration with a large group and doing co-design with teachers and administrators, decided to try a think, pair, share. And he came back, he's like, it's great. They said, you know, they talked to each other. And then when I called them back, they shared these ideas and it was super interesting. And I'm going to do another one tomorrow. So like becoming a different person who like is challenging their own beliefs about what does it mean if I walk into a classroom and like everybody's talking, you know, is that a bad thing? Is it a good thing? You know, what am I finding out? How do I structure this? So we have so many examples. I could go on for another hour, but those are like 3 or 4 of the ones that really jump out at me.
Well, Erin, again, I want to thank you so much for agreeing to come in and talk to the Science Teaching and Learning SIG. Again, everybody, the book is, I feel like I'm a podcast host, so I'm not. Formative Assessment for 3D Science Learning. This is a wonderful read. I highly, and there's lots more examples in the book of everything that Erin has talked about tonight. So Erin, on behalf of the SIG, I want to thank you once again.
Oh, thanks so much, Doug, for the invitation. This was really fun. And there's a lot more in the book that we didn't even talk about. So I hope people will check it out and that it's useful and interesting. So thanks for being here today.